Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the CSH. My name is Laurence Gauthier. I'm a historian based here at the Centre de Sciences Humaines. This evening, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Anindita Adhikari, as well as Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy. So before I let them present their work, I will first introduce both of them. Dr. Adhikari is a political sociologist and an assistant professor in social sciences at the National Law School in Bangalore. She completed her PhD in sociology at Brown University and was a postdoc fellow at the Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. Her research interests include social movements, bureaucracies, the politics of welfare provisioning, and democratic deepening. Dr. Adhikari's research has been informed by 15 years of public action work. She has been associated with the Right to Work, Right to Information, and Right to Food campaigns. She previously worked with the government of Bihar and the Ministry of Rural Development on employment, social security, and land issues. She also co-founded the organization named Social Accountability Forum for Action and Research in 2022, and this organization works on strengthening transparency and accountability in public service delivery in collaboration with state and national governments as well as civil society. Dr. Adhikari has published a large number of journal articles and book chapters, including most recently, Civil Society, the State and Institutionalizing Welfare Rights in India, co-authored with Patrick Heller in the journal World Development. This talk this evening will be based on her book project, Shikayat to Jawabdehi, Redeeming Rights and Democratizing the Local State in India. This project examines the effects of rights-based welfare expansion on local governance and civic action through a comparison between two accountability systems in Bihar. And to discuss her work this evening, we are very happy to welcome Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy, who is an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University. Dr. Krishnamurthy completed her PhD in anthropology at the University College London. She's also a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research and a non-resident scholar at the Center for the Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to joining Ashoka, she also taught in the Department of Sociology at Shiv Nadar University. Her research work pertains to a wide range of subjects and field sites, including women's courts and dispute resolution, community health workers and public health systems, agricultural markets, and land, water, and livelihood security. She also has a long-standing interest in the institution dynamics and everyday life of public systems and bureaucracies, and that's one of the many reasons why she's the perfect discussant for this evening's presentation, entitled Shikayat to Jawabdehi, Redeeming Rights and Democratizing the Local State in India. Thank you again to both of you for accepting our invitation.
Shikayat to Jawabdehi, Redeeming Rights and Democratization of the Local State in India. So we can move to the first slide. So until about 2 decades ago, the landscape of formal forums for ordinary citizens to participate in or make welfare-based claims in India was quite sparse. The terrain was quite spare and ranged from the ballot to the next slide, which is the barricade, which is typically how these two extremes have been described. And for the few that did have the wherewithal or the means to persist, the courts. The next slide, please. And for those who had the patience and the persistence, long waits at the block office. Next slide, please. And for the state, on the other hand, making the local bureaucracy accountable for public service delivery largely looked like this. So next slide. And after this, it gets easier. Or this. So you can keep moving through the next few slides. Yeah, you can keep moving. And sometimes like this, keep moving, thank you. So basically the tends to be top down with bureaucrats or political leaders keeping frontline functionaries in check with very occasional opportunities for citizens to be directly heard. So all this began to change in the early 2000s with what several scholars have called the emergence of India's new rights agenda. It's been described using various terms like audacious, radical, and so on. But I'm focusing on a particular part, a particular aspect of these reforms. So if we can go to the next slide. A fair bit of attention has been paid to the first wave of these major rights-based social policy expansion, which came with the introduction of the NREGA, the Right to Education, the National Food Security Act, which extended rights-based social security to close to 80 crore people across the country, and most importantly, a universal right to information. Now, the distinctive feature of these laws was not just legal entitlements to material benefits, but its commitment to delivering welfare in a manner that is transparent, that is participatory, and that is accountable. These were the commitments that were made alongside the commitment to these various rights-based social security benefits. And what they did was that they instituted a range of interfaces for claim making and oversight as part of the new welfare architecture. And these included social audits, local authorities to redress citizens' complaints, village monitoring committees, digital portals for disclosure of program records, and so on. And this was followed by a second wave of legislations, but also non-legislated policy reforms, institutional reforms, and so on, which is the bottom half of the timeline, introduced by various state governments, such as the right to public service laws, the right to hearing, which was quite short-lived in Rajasthan, and a right to public grievance redress in Bihar, which I'll be focusing on today. So these reforms created a new set of legal and institutional avenues for ordinary citizens to demand public services and seek accountability. So the formal claim-making terrain today is much more crowded than it was 2 decades ago. And there were several reasons that motivated me to look at these formal forums more closely. So we can move to the next slide. First, social audits, which are an exercise in which the state arrives at the doorstep of citizens to verify performance of public programs and register claims, has steadily expanded in coverage and in terms of legal mandates since they were first introduced. But an understanding of social audits, both in the literature and in public knowledge, even for those who are reasonably well informed, remains quite thin. So I teach a course on accountability and governance at the National Law School. And every year I begin with a quiz where I ask students what proportion of panchayats in the country do they think are audited. And I give them 4 options: less than 10%, 10 to 20%, 25 to 50%, and so on. And every year the majority of the class comes up with the wrong answer, which is that the coverage is less than 10%, perhaps closer to 2 to 5%. So every year they're off by a very large margin. So next slide, please. So social audits are really conducted in about half of the country's 250,000 panchayats across the country every year. And this figure, of course, can vary. So we see that in 2018, it was about 40% of panchayats, whereas in 2024, it was closer to 70%. And there's reasonable variation across states, as you see in the map on the right. Next slide, please. In addition to social audits, there have been a proliferation of online, in addition to social audits, we see that in 2009, only one state in the country had a right to public service law, but today, barring 6 states, and that might have also already changed, most states in the country now have a right to public service law. Next slide, please. In addition, there's been a proliferation of online grievance redress portals, public data portals, toll-free numbers, through which citizens can register claims and complaints. And each one has a name that tries to outdo the credentials of the other. So you see Rajasthan Sampark, you'll see Aaple Sarkar in Maharashtra, Jan Sunani in Orissa, and so on. Next slide, please. So the second thing of note is that the trends in the resolution of grievances across these different systems vary quite a bit as well. So for instance, we see near perfect resolution rates of claims and complaints that have been filed through grievance portals, while action on social audit findings remains quite elusive. So as you can see in the Wire article that's reported on the right, the Hindu article report on the right, we see poor rates of recovering misappropriated funds and disciplinary action, all to note are in public view. So we see these different trends in resolution rates across these different systems. Next slide, please. But it was really cases like Buddhinath Jha that led me to look at these claim-making practices and forums very carefully. So Budinath Jha, he was a 23-year-old regular user of the right to information law, and he also dabbled in journalism. He was from a middle-income, upper caste family in Bihar. His father was a contractual employee with the state's transport department. His brother worked as a bus driver and a conductor. And he studied in a government school and then got a college degree. And he was quite active in the student union there. He also worked part-time with a local private clinic, which gave him an insider's view on the malpractices within these private clinic systems, such as overcharging patients, doctors with fake degrees, fake admission records, kickbacks from public health insurance programs, and so on. So after he extracted information from using the RTI, he then decided to use what was then Bihar's recently introduced grievance redress law to take on the medical mafia. So Budinath Jha had filed several complaints against unlicensed private clinics in Madhubani district, and several hearings had taken place between 2020 and 2021. And the grievance redress officer had ordered action against some of the 19 private clinics that had been mentioned in Budinath Jha's complaint. And some of these clinics were actually shut down after action was taken on these complaints, and some were even fined up to 50,000 rupees. Now, many tried to dissuade Budinath Jha from pursuing his case, but Budinath Jha, of course, soldiered on. And his brother Triloknath Jha, who I met and interviewed later, said that Budinath Jha had become very stubborn. He was determined to not let any fake clinics operate in Benipatti in Madhubani. And midway through the hearings on the third complaint, Budinath Jha went missing. So 2 days later, his body was found, and he was found strangled. His body had been burnt and tossed into a field. So the hearing for his last and final complaint concluded with a pretty callous order, which said that the case is closed because the complainant was not present to clarify the details. So Budinath Jha's case is extremely tragic and disturbing, and does demonstrate how life-threatening claim-making forums like these can be to vested interests. And although the illegal clinics that were fleecing families and putting these lives in danger were brought under public scrutiny through these hearings, the response, of course, was far from adequate, and Budinath Jha had to pay with his life. So next slide. So contrary to expectations that the fear of backlash, the poor quality of redress would produce high levels of disenchantment, as the presence of these formal forums for claim making expand, we also see that the volume of claim making also went up. So for instance, we see, let's just take the right to information law, which we see is still under constant threat. Information commissions are being hollowed out, but the right to information law remains one of the most frequently used freedom of information acts in the world, with 60 lakh requests that are filed annually. Since the grievance redress law was introduced in Bihar, an average of 1.5 lakh claims are filed every year. And on average, 100 people attend a social audit public hearing in a panchayat. So if you just take the case of Bihar, where about 70% of panchayats were audited last year, approximately 450,000 people participated in these hearings in a given year. So these numbers are really quite staggering. So if you can just go a few slides back. But I'll continue. It's a few more. So what do we really know about these claim-making practices and systems? Most of these new legal mechanisms for claim-making have been put in place at the local level, but we know very little about them, let alone how these are working. We can go ahead. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So the focus of the legal mobilization and claim-making scholarship is sort of clustered at these two ends. So the social legal literature predominantly focuses on pleas to courts. So we think of Varun Gauri's work, for instance, and scholarship that looks at local claim-making practices focuses quite overwhelmingly on the role of informal institutions, such as brokers or party workers. Think Adam Auerbach, Bombay brokers. There's a huge amount of scholarship on these informal networks of mediation. So what do we know from the scholarship on the local state in India is that it is rent-seeking, it's overburdened, it's largely dysfunctional, and allergic to transparency. So the conditions for seeking information, asking questions, making claims on the local state has been historically hostile and demanded extreme levels of obsequiousness from citizens. So while not restricted to, the arbitrary exercise of state power is disproportionately experienced by the poor, women, oppressed castes, and so on. Local communities have a long history on relying on mediation to secure and access these public services. Next slide, please. Citizen claim making at the local level primarily takes place through three routes, all of which are informal. Citizen claim making at the local level, the first is through elected officials. So this is, again, think of Adam Orbach's work, or politicians, and has for long been understood through the lens of clientelism. Of course, more recent work on distributive politics in India challenges the idea of voters as passive recipients and shows how citizens are becoming quite creative in claim-making strategies to demand development from party workers. So the clientelism argument has been turned on its head. The second route is through intermediaries or brokers who use their personal connections to local officials to get clients to access a range of public services. Although even recent work is now showing how the leveling of brokerage networks has increased the bargaining power of citizens who can now make more demands. And the third mode of access is directly approaching officials and bureaucrats. But in the absence of any formal interfaces or legal frameworks, these encounters have historically been quite ad hoc, and responses have been quite discretionary. Next, please. Both sets of studies, while focusing on claim making from either above or from below, highlight factors such as legal knowledge, exposure to legal systems, social status, citizen capacities, kinship, neighborhood networks, organizational connections, and so on, to really explain who makes claims and when. So, however, as Gabby Crooks herself argues, claim making is not only socially produced, but also state induced, where the state's uneven rights terrain and variability in welfare provisioning creates a sense of aggrievement and therefore prompts action. So I build on this to argue that the variation in the institutionalization of rights alone is not an adequate catalyst for claim making, and there's more going on. And so that brings me to the two main questions that I asked through this work, which is how are platforms for accountability embedded in centralized and opaque bureaucracies? And the second part of this is, why does rights-based claim making really emerge through these formal forums in deeply unequal contexts where we would expect high levels of disenchantment? So I answer these questions through a series of, through different methods and sources. I situate my research in Bihar. Next slide, please. And there are many in the room who already know Bihar, so I'm happy to answer any questions. But I just do want to point out that this story it's not Bihar is a case. It's the context in which I situate my work. It's a difficult test case, but the lessons from this one state have implications in many other states, which could actually be quite different. So I look at two distinct but complementary legally backed platforms for claim making. They have different political origins, but they open up the state through similar logics, which is by bringing the state and citizens into a deliberative encounter where state and traditional social power can be challenged. Next slide, please. So these are basically social audits, which are people-led assessments of public services and governance. And the second is Bihar's grievance redress law. In this talk, I'm going to focus on the making and the practice of Bihar's grievance redress system, but I'm happy to talk more about social audits in the Q&A. Next slide, please. So fieldwork for this was conducted between 2019 and 21, but it's really ongoing. Multiple visits have been made since. Next slide, please. I draw on 70 hours of observation over 25 hearings, 18-week-long social audit cycles, about 80 semi-structured in-depth interviews with bureaucrats, grievance redress officials, social auditors, and so on. Third, I also conducted document analysis where I coded 475 affidavits that were filed during the social audit, 45 complaints filed under the grievance redress law, and so on. So now moving on to the case, which is, if we could skip one more ahead, please. Yeah. So, so I will focus on Bihar's grievance redress law. Next slide, please. So So yatras in Bihar, which you see on your screen here, which is, I think this was either the Vishwas Yatra or the Vikas Yatra. There were a series of these yatras that became the cornerstones of Nitish Kumar's um, political legacy, particularly in the first two terms. And of course, what you see on the right is the Janta Darbar that Nitish Kumar would hold in the capital city of Patna. Now, the popularity of the Mukhyamantri Janta Darbar largely rested on the belief that only complaints that were filed at the highest levels outside the web of local power brokers and structures would be given a fair hearing. So these were hugely popular at the time when they were started, and today every chief minister in every state has a similar looking Janta Darbar. The process was that once grievances were registered at the chief minister's Janta Darbar, they were sent to various departments who would then pass these downwards towards the district, that would then push it further down towards block level officers. Next, please. So between 2006 and 12, which is when these Janta Darbars were really active, 450,000 grievances had been filed across the state. But the system for collecting and hearing and resolving people's claims was still very highly personalized. So I call it a charismatic form of redress, where many claims remained unresolved or partially resolved for many, many years. There was no citizen oversight or participation in the process. In many instances, grievances often went back to the same bureaucrat for resolution that the grievance was filed against, or who had denied the entitlement in the first place. And while higher level bureaucrats who were directly answerable to the chief minister were quite compelled to publicly align their perceptions on the value of resolving citizens' grievances in this manner, lower level bureaucrats were much more disgruntled. So these are some of their candid statements, where they would say people have made filing complaints a profession. We need to keep a full record of the complainant. They have a political agenda. Complaints are only filed to pressurize officers, and so on. Next slide, please. So over the next few years, several subtle but transformative changes were made in the way citizens' claims were handled, which I see as a process of building legal consciousness within the bureaucracy. So the first was one of the first steps towards changing the view of the lower bureaucracy that grievances lacked specificity. So on the previous slide, there was a BDO who had said that most of the complaints which come to us are unresolvable, or they lack clarity, or we don't know how to proceed. So one of the first steps was to solve for that. So first was to actually articulate, to shift the burden of articulating the grievance in clear rule-based terms from the state, from the citizen to the state. So it was changing how grievances could be processed. So this was done by making the local bureaucrat and not citizens responsible for converting all grievances into what socio-legal scholars called relational claims which tend to be based more on narratives, tend to emphasize social relations and networks and people really, and often don't have the specificity of let's say documentation or evidence that can then be objectively verified. And the third was separating the facts which had to be investigated from the grievance itself. So categories and subcategories of complaints were coded inductively, reasons and evidence were made explicit. And this was a really painstaking process over 2 to 3 years in order to begin to really build this kind of legal consciousness, or a consciousness that grievances that came in were made legible to those who had to respond. So the first kind of challenge was, how do you make those grievances legible as opposed to being simply dismissed for lacking clarity? Next slide, please. So while legal consciousness was being next slide. Yeah, while legal consciousness was being built within the bureaucracy, the chief minister at that time also had to build normative commitment among legislators. So he framed the Lok Shikayat Kanun, which it's come to be called now, as a reform that was in the spirit of the JP movement, and he made this statement in the Legislative Assembly of moving from the power of rulers, Raj Satta, to the power of people, or Jan Satta. So his address in the Legislative Council on the day the bill was voted on pitted the bureaucracy against the political leadership and took on this populist tone. So he says there are too many irregularities in the governance system because of the disinterest of officials, their anichha, swecharita, lal fita shahi, etc. needs to be done away with, and public representatives have to hear citizens' complaints because of their irresponsible behavior. And this, of course, was lapped up by the opposition, who said that bureaucrats in the state have become very high-handed. They've got a free hand from the government. It's the duty of the state to discipline the bureaucracy, and so on. And this bill was actually passed fairly unanimously in the Legislative Council. Next slide, please. So with the passage of the law, these darbars were replaced by a legal right to redress now. So we've moved from charismatic to bureaucratic to a legal right to redress, where now citizens' claims were given further legitimacy and made what were previously quotidian acts of claim making justiciable. So the law covers all 44 departments, nearly 500 services, from land to social welfare to the functioning of police stations. It completely decentralizes the procedures through which citizens can make claims. And while darbars have not been entirely dismantled, they are supplemented by these khidkis that we see in every division and subdivision now across the state. And the most significant feature of this new law were hearings, where for the first time, citizens and bureaucrats were brought face to face before an independent authority. Next, please. So now I shift to the second part of the story, which is the law in practice. While the law had defined or set the terms of what is legally grievable, I find that pathways to receptivity and ultimately redress are constructed during the claim-making encounter, when legal categories interact with informal taxonomies of both the complaint and the complainant, and the professional identities of the grievance redress officer, as well as the testifying bureaucrat. So I go beyond the completeness of the resolution or the recorded satisfaction of the complainant and look for other outcomes of the hearing process. So for instance, I look at whether evidence and testimonies of the complainant challenges the power of the local state and dominant elites, whether hearings unsettle the local political settlement, how these claim-making encounters shape the perceptions and everyday practices of bureaucrats who participate in these hearings, and so on. So I acknowledge that participation in hearings alone will not change bureaucratic practices, but I analyze the ritualization of hearings, and I'll come back to this in a moment. I analyze the ritualization of hearings in which some form of procedural justice is performed, and I see whether that has an effect on norms and cultures of the local state. So that's sort of what I'm looking for, and moving in some ways the lens away from just redress and resolution rates as they are reported on official government websites and so on. And then scholars and researchers also tend to pick up on the same kind of metrics. So I try and look for others. So next slide, please. So after the law was introduced, 120 mid-level bureaucrats, which is basically the SDM level, the subdivisional magistrate level, were appointed as grievance redress officers. So now, while they share very strong ties with the testifying bureaucrat, they also express a range of commitment levels to upholding the law, performing fairness. So some would view their role as a safety valve between people and the state. Others would see themselves much more outrightly as a people's representative. And then there were those grievance redress officers who were much more cynical, and they would view these new forums as political, and had very strong views on the pressures that the lower bureaucracy has to face. So one grievance redress officer summed it up quite helpfully. He said, in 30% of the cases, I'm with the system, and in 70% of the cases, I'm with the public. And this varied. I'm sure it would vary if we asked everyone to give us a kind of proportional allegiance. Next slide, please. So the trajectory and outcome of the hearings is also shaped by the way the testifying bureaucrat, typically a welfare officer, also views the law. So a common refrain amongst welfare bureaucrats was that the multiplicity of accountability mechanisms that have been introduced in the last 15 years has stretched them really thin. So one of them said, how has the grievance law strengthened our capacity? It's like giving me a small Veer Kaman and sending me into the battlefield of the Mahabharat. Another view was that some felt that even the pressure of responding to claims had increased, but the complainant had been disciplined and did not bring unsubstantiated claims anymore. So this made them more amenable to the redress process. And then there were several bureaucrats who acknowledged that obfuscating by hiding of a claim inside a file and ruling by evasion, or tal-matol ki niti, was weakening. So that these were kind of the three different frames of orientations of the welfare bureaucrat towards this law. Next, please. So both grievance redress officers and the testifying bureaucrats use similar kinds of informal taxonomies to classify claims and complainants. So they distinguish between political and genuine complainants. Political complainants are generally seen as those who have some kind of social and political clout. They're typically landed, upper caste, and they're also sometimes identified as political by the frequency with which they file complaints. So some political complainants are seen as Samaj Sevis. They're often local journalists, seasoned RTI activists, youth leaders of political parties, local elected leaders at the bottommost rung of the panchayat structure, ward members who are also frequent users of these forums, as Sharan, who's also presented here in the past, alludes to in his writing and his research. Conversely, poorer, less educated complainants from Dalit and backward caste communities and women tended to be viewed as more genuine. So I find that the frame of the genuine complainant has broadly also been shaped by how welfare programs define the deserving. And those who are directly eligible and bring welfare-based claims are considered genuine, as opposed to those who filed claims on behalf of a group, of which they may or may not be members. Now, in some instances, the categories of political and genuine could be trumped by the substance of the matter and whether the claim is public spirited, such as poor material used for a drain construction, or particularistic, such as a land encroachment issue. And then finally, there are some claims that just test the legal limits of what can reasonably be addressed through the grievance redress forum. And often those are cases of, those are often land dispute cases, which require other changes in the law. And some of these matters are even pending in the High Court. Next, please. So I categorize the varieties of redress along two axes: resolution, which is when a complaint has been closed after action has been taken, and disruption, when the hearing and the resolution unsettles the local political settlement. And one does not necessarily follow the other. So in the first type of hearing, claims are not fulfilled, complaints remain unresolved, and the opaque exclusionary practices of the state are not challenged. So prevailing bureaucratic norms and practices persist, and the likelihood of citizens engaging in further claim making is lowered. This type of hearing does not open up the space for narratives of claimants to be expressed and the contestation or any kind of contestation and dialogue to really take place. These are cases where the grievance officer does not view their role as adjudicatory, or they see the law itself as detrimental to bureaucratic authority, which perfectly aligns with the testifying bureaucrat. So next slide, please. So these are hearings where claimants' narratives and evidence are most likely to be suppressed or dismissed. So we can see here the grievance redress officer in Aurangabad says the chief minister's image was suffering. Nothing was happening with the petitions that came to him. The media was also catching on and asking questions. He must have thought, let's just transfer the responsibility to another officer so that the blame doesn't fall on me. The law is not making the system any stronger, and the BDO is aware of his responsibilities. He already knows he's accountable. Ye sab bhram hai. The forum has been created just to put pressure on local officials through a circuitous route. So this is probably what we expect to hear in every, this is our default category. This is what we would expect every hearing to look like. But what I find is that this is not the only case that I encountered. So next slide, please. So in the second type of hearing, there is both resolution and disruption. So here there's a case of Amit Sani, who had studied, he had studied till about, I think, class 10 or 11, but he hadn't finished high school. He worked on a relative's poultry farm in Muzaffarpur, and he was associated with the youth wing of the JDU. So this was the first, when I met him, this was the first time he had filed a complaint under the grievance redress law. And I had met him at his third hearing. He had filed a complaint about the poor quality of a drinking water pipeline. This is that Nal Jal Yojana of the Bihar government in his village, which he states in his written complaint had been broken at various points, and a large amount of water was being wasted, and the pipelines had not been laid equitably. So before filing the complaint, he told me he had organized a protest of about 50 people in his village to highlight this issue, and even showed me a clipping from a newspaper that had covered this particular protest. Next, please. So the hearing lasted for about 15 minutes. And during this exchange, I saw that Amit did three things. He refutes the Mukhia's report. So when he says that there has been major embezzlement in the Nal Jal scheme, and he said, and then the grievance redress officer responded saying the Mukhia has sent a report saying the water is being supplied to that ward. So Amit said that is untrue. The contractor took the material and ran away. The husband of the Mukhia called me and threatened me. He told me not to interfere, otherwise whatever work is happening will also stop. He tried to bribe me to arrive at a compromise, but I refused. The ward member, Mukhia, and the Panchayat secretary are all on this together. So the first thing he does is he refutes the Mukhia's report. Two, he makes specific references to the local cabal of functionaries and ward members that were both siphoning money and offering bribes to buy his silence. And three, he challenges the BDO's account that he has tried to resolve the issue locally. So the BDO says later in this hearing, I have just been appointed. I was trying to understand the issue. Before I could do anything, he filed a complaint here. So Amit responded and said, I went to meet him thrice, but he didn't meet me. I was turned away by his staff. I also have one more request, sir. Please get all the wards inspected. So we see here that even though the grievance redress officer, if we go back to the orientations towards the law, the grievance redress officer actually had quite a cynical view of politically connected complainants. So Amit, being a member of the local youth wing of the JDU, would have fit that bill quite perfectly. But he focused on the substantive details of the complaint during the hearing. In addition to that, a lack of assertiveness by the testifying bureaucrat and weak evidence of action, in contrast to the very meticulous bundle of evidence provided by the complainant, pushed the hearing in a favorable direction. So here we see that the genuineness of the case trumped the motives of the political complainant. And I learned that after 3 more hearings and the submission of another report, which included photographic and video evidence, the case was closed, and the pipes had indeed been fixed and extended to wards that had been left out in Amit's village. So when I called him a few months later, I learned that was indeed the case. So this we see is a case where a complaint was resolved in favor of public interest and did challenge the local political settlement to an extent. Previous attempts at raising the issue, as we know from his attempt, his organizing of the protest, had actually been met with threats of violence. But by seeking adjudication through a formal forum where he level jumped, Amit escalated the complaint to one level above the local political structure. He also managed to effectively bypass it. So that's what he was able to do. That's what we see with this kind of case. Next, please. The third is what I call disruption without resolution. So disruptions, again, occur in varied ways and sometimes, of course, take extreme forms, as we saw in the case of Buddhinath Jha, where the nexus between district medical officers and business interests of private hospitals and clinics was exposed and destabilized, even though the complaint was never fully resolved. And Buddhinath Jha, of course, paid with his life. So that's one kind of disruption. But in less extreme cases, disruptions in bureaucratic cultures was also observed and expressed. So implementing authorities emphasized somewhat grudgingly how the time limit within which citizens' claims and complaints had to be answered had made them modify their daily routines, such as filing reports more regularly, visiting the field at the behest of citizen claimants. They would visit the field to do janch when they were directed by their superiors, but now they were having to go to the field on the behest of citizen complaints and within specific time frames. So we can see, next slide, please. So this was both observed but also expressed across the 6 districts where I conducted field work. So we see this block development officer in Aloli and Khagaria say that these laws have raised the public's expectations, maybe even too much. Either way, the attitudes of my officers have changed. They know that now what is or isn't in the file cannot remain hidden for long. People will file an RTI and demand to see what's inside. To avoid too many complaints reaching the district grievance officer, I've told my Panchayat Sevaks to open a register and record details of all demands and applications that come to them. And then he went on to say that he went on to put the blame on himself, saying that when I don't have enough time to meet people, brokers start cropping up. The real hearing, though, he asserted, is not at the grievance redress officer's chamber, but it's really in my office. So when people meet me is when their issue gets resolved, and that's when they're really satisfied. So he kind of also wanted to reassert his own authority. Okay, so just moving to the end of this. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, no, the previous one. Yeah. So just to summarize, as in the case of grievance hearings, which create these divergent pathways for responsiveness, in the larger project, I unpack how the local state can be democratized through carefully designed processes which ritualize deliberation and contestation between citizens and officials in, importantly, rule-based settings. So there's scholarship to suggest that legalistic and deliberative modes of governance, so I'm thinking of Akshay Mangala's work, have often been viewed as contradictory, where additional legal frameworks or accountability are only seen as increasing the compliance burden on the bureaucracy. But I build on social legal scholar Charles Epps' work here, and I argue that in an institutional context like India, the law continues to be a powerful and even subversive medium through which new civic norms such as deliberation, fairness, transparency, and dignity, importantly, and dignity. So even the way the grievance redress hearings are set up, where the parivadi or the applicant sits next to the bureaucrat whose office this person may have been waiting outside of for days or weeks, is no mean matter, and it's even in its symbolic value, it is significant. So so there is this ritualization and this infusion of civic norms of deliberation, fairness, transparency, and dignity, which can, through law, be standardized and infused into state practices. So while the legitimating symbols and procedures of court-like proceedings in some cases could be seen as just performative, emphasizing process values can make decision-making and adjudication more citizen-centric or fairer or more service-oriented, as some scholars refer to it. Next, please. Now, introducing the law is one thing, but building a normative commitment is another. So I argue that building this normative commitment requires a cyclical embedding of two types of ethos. This is done through internal mechanisms such as rules, training, selective recruitment, but also through repeated deliberative interactions with citizens through these rule-based settings, as we just saw in the various cases. So while much of the legal consciousness literature tends to focus on marginalized citizens or those who are coming to the state, this story emphasizes the importance of building legal consciousness within. So kind of casts a slightly different view. Next, please. And third, by participating in hearings, citizens learn about the criteria and parameters for decision-making. So it gives citizens access to evidence that is produced by officials and an opportunity to scrutinize and invoke an appeals process, which then can incentivize further claim-making. So Miranda Fricker, she develops this idea of epistemic injustice, which refers to a wrong done to someone as a knower or transmitter of knowledge due to unjustified prejudice. Someone is unfairly judged to not have the knowledge or reasonable beliefs that they actually have. So I'm quoting Miranda Fricker here. And a specific form of this, she shows us, is testimonial injustice. When a person's testimony is judged to be not or less credible because of prejudice and not because the testimony itself is unreasonable. So this credibility deficit, of course, as we know, will impact marginalized groups more. And so what the hearing does, whether it's closed door or whether it's public, in the case of the social audit Jan Sunwais, which is the other case, it creates an opportunity for narratives that break with bureaucratic order to be expressed. Narratives that emerge either during this individualized public hearing or the Jan Sunwai are often stories of struggle and oppression, but also importantly of defiance and refusal. So it's not just one kind of narrative, but there is a space for these multiplicities of narratives to be expressed. So they create a space where both participants and observers, in the case of the theater of the Jan Sunwai, there are observers. In this case, there aren't any. when these testimonial exchanges take place, what happens is what begins to build then is a testimonial sensitivity, is what I want to add to the work that's already out there. So finally, hearings create a space where those who typically wield little power can tell stories of their encounters with power, highlighting unfairness, humiliation, disadvantage, lack of recognition, and there's quite a range. At the same time, the hearings can also become a space where stories of temporary reversals of power and resistance can also emerge. So unlike arguments which are focused just on the weighing of evidence alone, narratives then can have a potential to challenge received knowledge, change assumptions and mindsets, and potentially disrupt established order. So these are, of course, all of these propositions can, I hope, will be tested, taken forward, and I hope to continue this research to see and follow up on the various cases that I encountered during my work, and to see how many of these have really embedded and kind of changed local bureaucratic culture beyond the initial years of the law being in place. So I'll end here, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Adhikari. I've been waiting to call you that in a formal setting. So that's really exciting to have this opportunity. Thank you very much, Laurent, and to CSH for the invitation to be a discussant today. And it's really lovely to see everyone here, also those online. So I'll take just a few minutes because I'm sure there will be lots of questions and we'll want to hear more from Oni herself. So I wanted to start with like just 2-3 thoughts about why I think this is so important. And so beyond just, finishing the dissertation, putting it out there for us, being able to write a book, I think it's really important the kind of intervention this makes, right? Because there's been for some time now a call for us to move beyond thinking about elections and electoral democracy and participation to this in between, the cultivation of democracy, what you were talking about, deepening democracy, the everyday, the in between, what happens between elections. Mukulika's, and I know you wrote an interesting review of it, this cultivation of democracy. And I don't think we have too many examples, right? So what happens is everybody says that, and then we have very few thick descriptions of it in political science and political sociology. We still have this tendency to default back to the event. And here there are lots of events, the hearings are events, but it really gives us a sustained example of what this might look like, right? And I think that's so important because they're always searching for these examples, don't always find them. And interestingly, they're often there only in these sites of what is contestation. So you mentioned briefly my work on agricultural markets and I work in mandis, some of you know this work, but the mandi was never a site. People used to say, you don't come to the mandi for a satisfaction survey, right? It is actually a site of contestation. If everybody is happy in a mandi, something is going wrong, something is fixed. These are actually sites where contestation is extremely important. Forms of antagonism are important. And actually that's vital to democratic, because democracy is actually also competitive. Even electoral democracy is competitive. So we have this tendency to think of the competition that happens during elections, and the rest of the time is supposed to be this equilibrium moment where people are dominating, controlling. But actually, it's in the moments of exchange and tension and deliberation and competition in the in-between, not in the settlement of the in-between. So we think about, the election is competitive. If you have a democracy, then you have settlement, which is settled. And then you have competition again. But actually, the cultivation of democracy means not settling in the middle. Like it's actually the competition and both the redressal, but also the disruptions that you're talking about. So I think this is really important for us to think about. The second, I think, is on the other side of the corrective, because lots of people have, of course, paid a lot of attention to participation and over the many years in development and in welfare provision. And also a fair number have now paid attention to social audits. And anthropologists, amongst others, have been quite responsible for this, but we've become quite cynical about participation. So on the other side, you have the situation where the performative, and I think performative is useful. I worked on Nari Adalats, they're very performative. Performativity was never actually like fake or banal. I mean, we all represent ourselves all the time. But somewhere in the critical literature, when we use performativity, we somehow seem to be talking about something that is not real. And we very rarely pay attention to the after effects or the afterlife and what actually it means to put up a show. And this word has just become, about self-expression or certain kinds of, we use Jumla in different ways today. But the idea is that performance is not, it's actually very significant when it is done in these ways. And somehow we've all become so critical of the idea of the performance itself or acts of performance in the literature. And so social audits, other things, also elite capture. So the critique has been very strong. And again, I'm not saying that the critique has no validity or that often there isn't a lot of intermediation or there isn't a lot of elite voice and representation or civil society is always wonderfully embedded and grounded. None of that. But I am saying that somewhere we went too far in that direction. And what I really appreciate, I think, about this work is that it does the hard work of staying with description, of attending closely, of observing, of listening, of documenting, and then letting us decide what might be happening, taking into account both gains as well as what isn't working, right? And where we are reproducing certain kinds of inequalities or structures or exclusions. And I don't think you're saying this is wonderful. There is no glorification here. And it's not easy to write and to do this kind of work where you create space for hope without glorifying, and keep that space to be critical about it, right? So I think that's what's exciting here. So I just wanted to sort of start with why I think for these two reasons, right, on both of these ends, I think this is so important. I think where it'll be very interesting to hear you kind of open up the space a little more. And I think, again, and I know this because we've worked over the years, it's so nice to see range, right? Like, yes, of course, a lot of what we might expect, the bureaucrats who dismiss this and others, but there are also those who don't. And then, like I said, we'll come back to this question of the performance and the fact that it produces effects that are unexpected, or that if we don't attend to, we may see as failure, right? Again, we are very used to asking in development, this is from the anti-politics machine on, why do things that fail continuously succeed and keep coming back, right? And the success is never because they help people. The success is because consultants get extra jobs or bureaucracy extends itself or those kinds of things. Whereas your last case, disruption without resolution, is where apparent failure is productive differently. It is also producing something, and we have to learn to pay attention to those effects as well, right? This is again core to democracy. Why actually standing for election even when you lose is important, right? It means somebody might at some point vote for you, right? Eventually, I mean, even in cases where we've had 40 years of one party win, others always contested. And they didn't contest because it was a fixed game from the beginning. They contested because there was always the possibility that they just might win, right? Mandi people would also tell you this. The Mandi and Mandis of different kinds are about competition. So they will always tell you, if you cannot lose the game, then it's not a market. Right? It's fixed, then it's not a market. So if you could never win an election, then it's not an election. It's not a fixed election. There is no such election as one where you cannot lose, right? That possibility must always be there. So I think paying attention to what that effort, repeated effort, even when it doesn't lead to a resolution, produces is really important. So in recent work, we're doing quite a lot of this work on relational state capacity and thinking about the exchange. So here's where I think a little more can be like opened up, right? One is this question of encounter. So is it an encounter with the state? Is it actually a form of exchange? Is there some, like, what kind of interaction is this, right? We often use encounter to stand in for many types of interactions. And it would be interesting to think about, you're saying it sets up a deliberative encounter. But a deliberative encounter is a very funny thing. How do I encounter something deliberatively? Do I also exchange? Like it's more than an encounter. It's actually some form of exchange. This is where the relational contract, the relational, the incompleteness, sure. There is hierarchy, sure. There is petitioning, but there has to be that hearing, right? And it's very interesting. I think there's something for you to do conceptually with this idea of hearing. Is hearing different from listening? Can you hear but not listen? You can. But a public hearing is often thought of as something where you are heard but not listened to. Deliberation, on the other hand, makes me think, does it force them to listen also? And some of your examples of when it works seems to be where you're actually listening and not just hearing, right? You're not just hosting, like there's something more that's happening. There is actually a change. You're actually taking into account what people are saying. You're admitting something. See, government has a lot of these words. So I found myself listing listening, hearing, receiving, acknowledging. Like there's a whole series of terms that we use when petitions are submitted, when things are done. And I think there's something happening here that needs some more thinking through. They're clearly public hearings. So hearing is a good play on words, but is more happening than hearing, right? And so hearing like a state might work, but and the state often hears and acknowledges, will partially listen, will stop listening. You can see it in courts as well, right? But the idea of is something to be thought through. So that was one thing that I think you left there. And then, like you said, hearing like a state, and then I was like, okay, let's develop, there's something to be developed there. The other area where I found myself starting to think and get a little, I thought your thing on, legibility, relational claims, evidence, how it is entering and changing government practice. I thought that was, in bureaucratic practice, that was excellent. But then there's this charisma to bureaucracy to legal. And you're using charismatic for the darbar, or where personal things solve the problem, right? But patronage is often also very personal, but it's not just charismatic. Like there's something, so the word charisma, is this charismatic? Often like institutions can also have charisma, right? And so I wonder actually whether the hearings also have a form of charisma. And the Jansunwais also. So is charisma really about the individual? Or is it about individual effectiveness versus bureaucratic effectiveness versus a form of legal, practice or presence? So I'm not sure whether, because, the Supreme Court is a very charismatic institution. And so courts also have, and hearings, like I said. So I don't know, I think there's something to be worked out with the charisma being tied to individuals. I can see why politicians have charisma. So the political darbar is a very interesting type of darbar. One of the things I remember asking people once in Madhya Pradesh about when, again, during field work, what's the difference when two political parties, Congress and BJP, what happens, what changes in the city? How can you tell who's in power? And they said, actually, one of them has a history. And this was the Congress has a history of having darbars. So the ministers' homes would always be crowded with people. And today, one of the things they said, the change in political culture is the ministers' homes are not crowded, right? And that's again very interesting because again, we are very obsessed with disintermediation. And actually, some of these kinds of things, like the bureaucrat holding a hearing, we all know district collectors who would have open hours where people would come in and listen, out of time. So again, it made me think, what happens when a darbar becomes a khidki? What happens when the khidki becomes a portal? Right? There's actually material changes in how this then gets negotiated. So this is the other thing that's, struck me as really, really interesting, because there are very different kinds of places of hearing. And so do they assemble, in certain kinds of ways, because one of the things about the portal is you do it on your own. So it's a single window to many things. Like, so the idea of the portal being one entry point, but you don't interact with other people, right? Whereas the darbar was a place where you only settled your problem, but you were part of many other problems. So again, just the way in which the individual problem gets resolved differently when you're hearing many other problems at the same time. Again, why the hearings in the court is interesting. I think you're really on to something with this ritualization of hearings. This was something that I would see a lot also, and that's why the last point that you make about disruption without resolution being important, right? What does it actually achieve? Because I think often in the Nari Adalat case also, it was about procedural familiarity also, right? About getting familiar with the process. And you were able to do, so it's very interesting to ask, what are the spillovers? What happens when you put in a case, even if it doesn't work? Are you more likely to try it again? Are others more likely to try it again? Are others likely to ask for certain kinds of resolution elsewhere? Like, what have you learned in the process itself, right? But I also think, and I was thinking about a book that Didier Fassin and all these guys had done on, it's called The Moral Heart of the State. And it's very interesting the way that narratives work, right? And the way in which both sides have to narrativize. So new narratives come in. And again, this makes me think about the exchange, how you present your case. And on the other side, how is your case then narrativized by the officer themselves, right? Where they have this new view about whether somebody is a legitimate or genuine complainant, right? And that's how they tell this person's story. And so they also narrativizing the way you're judging whether somebody is a good complainant, just like you decide whether somebody deserves state support or an immigration or a refugee card or whatever. It was always in those things where the narratives mattered, right? It was the stories they told, looking at the information about the people, that helped people make their decision. But it made me also think about law, because you're talking about law and the particular role of law. And one of the things you didn't mention was precedents. And so I wondered, does this start producing, not just in practice and ritualization, but also in the consciousness, and in the form of how you judge things, some notion of precedents getting established, right? These are the cases, this is what has happened in the past, so this is what we now think, how we're beginning to lodge. So I couldn't tell from the exams, but I wonder whether something is happening there in that type of precedence thinking. And because it's not legal in the same way, but law does this. It establishes precedents, and that sort of gets codified in certain ways, right? And so that I'm curious, particularly when it gets legal from the bureaucratic, right? The bureaucratic is also interesting. It depends on precedent, but it depends on this file moving in a certain way. So legal precedents and bureaucratic precedents are not the same in how they're established. So I'm just wondering whether, in this kind of context, what is the role, of precedence here? Yeah, I mean, I thought there was so much else to kind of pick up, and we can do that in time, but I'll just leave you with these to start.
Suggest that maybe you can take a few minutes. I was going to say a few seconds. No, certainly not. A few minutes to answer some of Mekla's main comments. You need not address all of them because that might take too much time, and we want to keep time open for questions. But maybe take a few minutes.
No, thank you so much, Mekla. I always walk away with just so many new ideas when I talk to you. So this is really fantastic and very helpful to also deepen the work. So I think more than kind of responding, I want to be able to deepen in this direction, because I think the question of precedence is actually very interesting. And it is sort of what I'm suggesting when I say that this incentivization of claim making is that, how many repeat players, for instance, how many repeat complainants come, who are these complainants also matters. So of course all the cases I presented here were men, but there were fewer cases, but there were cases of women, and also these were people with connections. There were fewer cases, but they were significant. There were cases of those who lacked those connections. So what is the likelihood of those who we least expect now to come again, or to use the system again, is one that I do want to pursue. But importantly, how does the system then respond to a similar set of complaints when they're brought again and again? So is there a feedback effect? Does it flow up, or is it still being settled in that encounter/exchange? Is one that my understanding is that it's still being settled in the exchange. It's not changing or transforming the process in the way that precedents perhaps should. Is just one observation. I think your points about receiving, listening, acknowledgement, hearing, it's great that you felt that there was a thread through these different aspects of how the state listens. So it is very much about, and that's what I'm trying to move the scholarship on with this work, is that we've spent a lot of time thinking about oral democracy, for instance, how people speak, or voice in democratic in democratic context, or local democracy. But what does it mean for the state to listen? And these are the various modes of listening. So receiving, acknowledgement, creating a people's paper trail. These are all ways in which the state is actually learning to listen. So I do want to move it from kind of the oral to the auditory in a way, with and can kind of sort of balance out the focus that there is in the work that's out there.
Auditory always means accounting and not listening, right? Like and so that's an interesting move. Like I'm saying, so we always have the risk of becoming very like attached to our metaphors and going far too much down this hearing path. But I do think, and it can get quite irritating and then weak. But I think there is something here, because we've paid a lot of attention not only to the idea of the documentary and of a certain kind and the audit and the account, but also the surveyed, right? So the viewing, much less to the listening and the hearing kind of thing. So I think there is something there.
So I said thank you for that, and there's lots more to say, but I'd love to hear from those in the room if you have questions or comments or ways that things that spoke to you that I could build on as I look to kind of move this towards a book potentially.
But thank you to all of you for coming. For those of you who are online, thank you also for your participation. And of course, again, many thanks to Anindita and to Mekla for their wonderful discussion. And yes, please join us for drinks just after this. Bye.